Hi. How are you? Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Nice to see you.
Nice seeing you as well. It's really a pleasure. We are already online, so I think I will be making, a short presentation, and then we will proceed. We will have today. We will have a special anchor in our broadcasts. She is already ready, so I think I will. It's 1 o'clock. We are already in Facebook. And we are already in Zoom as well. So first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It is really a great pleasure to be with all of you. We really have a very high number of people that is following us in our webinar series. This is, of course, because we have a very, very special guest and a very interesting topic to deal with. Let me just tell you that I am the director of South Asia Democratic Forum. This is a small think tank established in Brussels that is specialized on South Asia. We are the only ones that are following the political as well as the regional economic cooperation situation in the region. You can see a lot of details on us through our website and a lot of publications. And you can also see our team. And first of all, Dr. Faisal Devji, I would like to thank you very much for you to join our board of advisors. It is a great honor. It is a great opportunity for us to be guided by you, and we are very much looking forward to the fulfillment of this cooperation. Dr. Devji is a professor of Indian history and director of the Asian Studies Center at the Oxford University. He will speak today about India, China, and the Unmaking of Asia. It is an absolutely brilliant title that says a lot about you and about what we are expecting. Really, I was really overwhelmed when I saw this suggestion of yours. It's really the most important topic of our times, I think, in geopolitical terms. We are really all of us very keen on listening to you. We will have today as anchor Anna Madatali. She is the youngest member of our team, the youngest, but by far, well, the most brilliant, I think. She is absolutely fantastic, and she has been just as she arrived, she has been opening new ways in all directions, and we are very grateful for our cooperation, especially in the context of the present webinar. Today she is going to be the anchor, so I will be disappearing from screen. She will be coming in. The floor is yours. Anna, thank you very much for putting all of this together, please.
Well, thank you, Paulo, for that introduction. Good afternoon to all, once again, those here with us on Zoom and those joining us via our Facebook live stream. It is indeed a pleasure to welcome Faisal Devji to our Board of Advisors and to our webinar series. Dr. Devji is certainly one of the most important intellectual interlocutors in the field of South Asian studies. Faisal is joining us today from Oxford, but before that he taught at Yale and also at the University of Chicago. He was a junior fellow at the Society of Fellows at Harvard University and he is the author of 4 distinguished books: Landscapes of the Jihad, The Terrorist in Search of Humanity, The Impossible Indian, and Muslim Zion. Faisal Dibji has been described by fellow South Asianists as one of the few global intellectuals out there and the most brilliant scholar of his generation writing today on South Asia. I am certain that what we'll hear in this afternoon's talk will give us much to think about, and I will cut it short, but first a note on our Q&A session after the talk. Those joining us via Zoom will have the opportunity to ask questions via the question box mechanism here. We kindly request that when you ask your question, you state your name and affiliation so that we can identify you later when addressing your question. That said, and without further delay, Dr. Faisal Dibji, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be invited both to serve on the advisory board of the South Asia Democratic Forum, but also to speak to you on this subject today. Basically, I'm going to be, as a historian, and you will forgive me for approaching the subject historically. I'm not an IR specialist or a political scientist, but I hope that the historical context that I aim to provide will allow you to situate current developments, which I will also refer to towards the end of my talk. So while Asia's name goes back to the Greeks and Romans, the regions now bearing it only came to do so in the age of European colonialism. Its original geography in those areas directly abutting Europe has long since been reduced to a border zone called the Near or Middle East, displacing even the older term Asia Minor. The mediating role of this place without a proper name, it's interesting how the Middle East is no longer considered to be part of Asia and has no proper name. So the mediating role of this place was made clear by Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, who saw Islam as a product of the Near East that both linked and separated Europe from Asia and Africa in cultural and economic terms. But he also absorbed Islam, which was seen as defining what came to be known as the Middle East, into the German world, where it mediated between the Catholic and Protestant stages of Christianity. So both Islam and the Near or Middle East end up playing this purely mediating role. Now, in a remarkably influential formulation, Hegel went on to describe the real or further Asia, what we also know as the Far East, as being dominated by India and China, each representing a distinctive and also opposing civilization. Asia, in other words, was defined and indeed continues to be defined not by its internal similarities, but rather its differences, with China understood as being given political form by a centralized imperial state, and India by an anarchical caste society. Now, this is Hegel, but Marx, who of course took pleasure in turning Hegel on his head and therefore in his view setting him upright, seems to have had a reversed view of this, where it was India that represented the great imperial state and China that represented a civilization defined by its society. In either case, of course, Asia is being defined in a binary way through an opposition between India and China, and the rest of the continent is seen as falling somehow in between these two behemoths. And we see this in the way in which Europeans come to describe these other geographies: Indochina, Southeast Asia, etc. Now, this description of Asia as a dualism of contrasts remains normative to this day, most recently allowing India to be seen as democratic in its essential nature and China as being correspondingly authoritarian. In the contemporary period, of course, you can see how this dualism of contrast is globalized. So it's not simply that India is a democracy as opposed to China, but India has to be globalized as part of a larger democratic strategic framework, say in the term Indo-Pacific, while China's authoritarianism is globalized in a phenomenon, or I don't know what else to call it, such as the One Belt, One Road structure that it is attempting to build up. So however long its history of interrelations, Asia has rarely, in my view, possessed any reality, even of an imagined kind, either in India or China. This is, in other words, a European construction, whereas Europe might have a civilization identity, and in many ways the Americas. Asia and Africa, I don't think do. Indeed, in Asia itself, the idea of an Asian civilization or unity was only appropriated by the Japanese Empire, in this term, the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. All subsequent attempts to create pan-Asian institutions, including the non-aligned movement and ASEAN, have been bloodless abstractions. India and China each try to corral their own regional alliances, despite occasionally venturing into the other's neighborhood. And it is only the tiny state of Singapore that, with its ethnic hierarchy of Chinese, Malay, and Indian origin citizens, is forced to tout Asian values as the unifying rhetoric, privileging conservative status above all else. So while many of the countries in this region occasionally lay claim to the identity Asia as a civilizational form, in fact, this Asia has always been identified by dualism of contrasts, as I suggested earlier, but also Asian values and Asian institutions have had really remarkably little force or play there. Now, while setting them up as contrasting principles for Asia's future might have a European history, this way of thinking at least pairs India and China as Asian powers. Outside such geopolitical and civilizational models, however, the two countries possess no culturally or historically deep relations. And despite being closely connected neighbors over millennia, they never have. This is a fascinating situation. The most important fact about Asia, in other words, is that it doesn't exist except as a geographical and therefore economically and politically connected space, which is to say it is gradually escaping European definitions by repudiating cultural and civilizational identifications. In other words, the so-called emergence of Asia only becomes possible with the repudiation of Asian identity and Asian civilization, not the reverse, which is what we are constantly being told. The comparison between India and China, therefore, is neither civilizational nor deeply historical as a set of linkages, but entirely modern and political in character. And because these countries have now entered Euro-American geopolitics as allies and rivals of the old great powers, their respective anti-colonial visions of Asian or Afro-Asian solidarity have also collapsed, despite efforts to reframe them in new ventures of economic exploitation, if only to avoid being labeled a new imperialism. In other words, Asia as a whole loses reality the stronger these and other countries in the region become. So, going back to what I just said about ASEAN, or indeed even more importantly, the non-aligned movement, there were moments in the anti-colonial struggle of these countries and in the post-colonial period where Asia or the Third World or Afro-Asia or any number of other global formulations were brought forward as a way of situating India and China with their neighbors and with other countries around the world. These ways of thinking are also being winnowed away and indeed collapsing the more India and China emerge as global powers in their own right. Their absorption into Euro-American geopolitics as would-be equal partners and rivals then both liberates India and China from colonial categories, such as the one Asia with its definition of contrasting dualities, while binding them to the West's own identities. In the meantime, anti-Chinese and anti-Indian sentiment is increasing in parts of Africa, while the fundamentally hostile relationship between India and China themselves has not been altered by bilateral summits or volumes of trade. The long-standing popularity of what is known as Chinese food in India and the more recent taste for Hindi cinema in China appears to bear little relationship with any real interest in the countries they supposedly represent. It might as well have been Italian food and Turkish television series. But it is true that even without a deep history, Asia as a non-civilizational space has become the site of various kinds of modularity. From the so-called Shanghai model touted in India as an urban model for Mumbai in particular, to Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, and on its western fringes, Dubai, as new models of urban modernity. For both India and China, it seems, and perhaps for others as well, Europe and even America no longer represent modernity and the future, but rather history and the past, which is what draws increasing numbers of Asian tourists there. It's interesting, in the 19th century, Asians used to go to Europe and America to glimpse a site of modernity. Today they go there for medieval cathedrals and historical sites. These tourists and other visitors for whom Euro-American societies also represent markets and sites of investment, much as Asia once did for the latter, now outnumber the large Chinese and Indian diasporas settled in these countries. Again, a relatively recent and not much commented upon change. It is now tourists and other kinds of visitors from India and China who outnumber the Indian and Chinese diasporas in the West. And such diasporic populations are increasingly turning into touts and mediators between their countries of origin and residence, no longer capable of playing the role of a fortunate elite which has managed to escape from a life of squalor, misery, and lack of consumer choice. As between India and China, therefore, the only significant relations between these countries and the West are political and economic. And it is to obscure this political and economic relationship, whether it is one of similarity or difference, that cultural and historical ties are invoked on all sides. These ties can be invoked in a national or transnational and potentially even imperialist register to describe alliances and enmities that subordinate the freedom so essential in political life to the realm of inherited necessity. So we are constantly trying to lock back the choices that are made geopolitically in this region to inherited histories. And of course, some of that is certainly true, but I would hesitate to ascribe these ties to some great civilizational inheritance. The question facing India and China is what and how to inherit from a West whose power is still great and requires managing, but which they both recognize as unable, or they think they recognize as unable to possess the future. Now, this question, I think it's a fundamental question, has a longer history, of course, going back to decolonization, when these countries had to struggle not only to inherit political forms like the modern state itself, set within colonial borders, but also to discard other aspects of such an inheritance. Indeed, the struggle over what to inherit from Europe goes back to the 19th century, when it was a question of modernity. How can we be modern? What do we need to appropriate from Europe and what do we need to reject? At the time of independence, the question takes on a slightly different countenance, where the struggle has to do with how to make a colonial territory into a nation state. Now, India sought to do this by resigning her colonial role externally of maintaining the security architecture of the Indian Ocean with her army, or until the Gulf boom of the 1970s, by servicing its economy with her plentiful supply of indentured and migrant labor. So what I find fascinating about India in this period of independence is that she very quickly rejects the imperial role that she had been playing globally until then. And that, of course, had to do with, as I just said, securing a whole security architecture of certainly the Western Indian Ocean, but even to some degree of the Eastern Indian Ocean with her troops. India was a great base for British troops, as we know. The Middle East is particularly part of that security architecture, but also provisioning the British Empire with her plentiful labor and raw materials. And her diaspora is used in this effort as well, both by the empire and by the anti-colonial nationalists. After 1947, all of this suddenly seems to collapse by a deliberate set of decisions. So, India really transforms her imperial self, if you will, after independence, though she appears to keep a lot of the internal imperial distinctions in place, and I can come back to that later. And yet India was unable to extricate herself from the British Empire's forward policy of indeterminate buffer zones made up of princely states and tribal belts, so as to demarcate proper boundaries with her neighbors, Pakistan and China. So, of course, these boundaries had been left deliberately vague as part of an imperial forward policy, and India was never able to solidify these borders. And as we know, it's this problem of colonial inheritance that has led to, or at least initiated, her long-standing conflicts both with Pakistan and with China. This is true, of course, in reverse as well. It's true of Pakistan and China's relations with India, as it is of Pakistan's relations with Afghanistan, let's say, right? So Pakistan was, for the same reason, unable to agree her border with Afghanistan. Both the Durand and McMahon lines defeating India and Pakistan's attempts to define themselves as nation states by forcing upon them the inheritance of an empire they have been unable to bear. In other respects, of course, these states were eager to take on an imperial inheritance, even if for rather different reasons. Pakistan's repeated deployment of her armed forces in the Persian Gulf to assist Saudi Arabia, for instance, mimicked the way in which the British Indian Army was used there, though she was unable to gain the same advantages of suzerainty from such actions. India and China's post-colonial relations were for many decades defined, therefore, by the problem of scaling down their joint imperial inheritance, the inheritance that could not be really resolved or wished away. An inheritance that included Tibet, crucially, and the Indian Northeast, both disputed territories for India and China. One which made it impossible for either of them to come to an agreement about their borders. While this problem remains, however, it's been scaled down continuously, their current engagement derives from the scaling up of regional conflicts, whether it is China entering South Asia through her military and trading alliance with Pakistan in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or through ports in Sri Lanka, or India seeking to enter East Asia by forming similar relations with Japan or Australia, the Quad, for instance. And this scaling up has been made possible by their newfound, if unequally distributed wealth, derived from joining the international financial system. So for many decades, we had the effort to scale down an imperial inheritance, which had to do with borders for the most part. And now we have a kind of, that continues, but we have a kind of scaling up regionally of their conflict in different parts of this vast arena, no longer those border parts necessarily. So the economic muscle of these countries has made empire a new kind of question for them. On the one hand, what I've been describing is how they deal with the inheritance of empire. Now I want to talk about, if you will, a new imperial form that has emerged. But this form is manifested in the name of nationalism, with the violent subordination of certain groups and regions in China and India, justified as integration, even as it explicitly creates an unequal order of citizenship in a quite novel version of imperial pluralism. So you might say that in the early decades of their independence, India and China both struggled as part of this, the challenge of inheriting the empire, to transform imperial frameworks or arenas into national ones through what was known as national integration. This sort of thing still seems to continue, but I think it has moved in a different direction. Now it's no longer national integration so much, but the creation, not even as a pretense, but the creation of different kinds of racial, religious, regional, and other kinds of hierarchies in a kind of strange throwback to what I'm calling imperial pluralism. But then we see the invocation of empire the world over, from Brexit's references to the British Empire and Commonwealth to Turkey's neo-Ottoman politics, and even the EU's negative vision of Charlemagne's empire as seen in the mirror of the immigrants' allegedly Islamic imperialism. Now, perhaps the most visible demonstration of empire's return to modern politics is to be found in those movements that have rejected secessionist or even reformist nationalism as an aim. At the moment, these include the Hong Kong protests and Kurdish revolution, but also arguably the, anti-India struggle in Kashmir, all of which seems to have abandoned a kind of classical nation statist ideal. They no longer have this idea of secessionism in order to create a new kind of nation state, but seem to be struggling against the nation state form itself, while nevertheless desiring some manner of freedom. So these new struggles against, in this case, India and China, but also other countries around the world, might be territorially defined, but they don't gesture towards the nation state as a model. To them, we can add global or deterritorialized movements like environmentalism or even non-state terrorism in the Al-Qaeda mold. Such groups not only characterize their opponents as imperialist in a conventional way, but more importantly, acknowledge a certain failure of the nation state as a model for independence. Even ostensibly nationalist movements like that for Tibet seem to be abandoning the nation state form to imagine a new kind of pseudo-imperial order that might grant them autonomy. The struggle in Hong Kong seems to be a struggle not for independence, but autonomy. It's as if these new kinds of struggles take seriously the neo-imperial forms that these new globally emergent states are adopting and try to recreate a different kind of plurality within them. Now, some of these movements, such as the Kurdish one, are more usefully described as anarchist, though they struggle with domesticating the figure of state sovereignty, and it might be possible to place them within a hidden genealogy of anti-colonial resistance for which the state had always been viewed with suspicion as being inherently imperialist. This would include figures like Mahatma Gandhi, but also the early Islamists who wanted to divest politics of sovereignty by reserving it for God. So there's a longer history, I'm suggesting, that goes back to the early 20th century, in which these figures, Asian, Middle Eastern, and other figures, are intensely suspicious, not just of the imperial state, of course, but of the nation state itself, which they see as linked inextricably to empires. The anarchist project, of course, can go in a leftist as well as rightist direction, and even in a libertarian or neoliberal one. In any case, the gradual repudiation of the nation state as a model impels us to ask whether we have exited the post-colonial moment insofar as it is understood as a nationalist one. I would like to suggest that even setting aside these figures of struggle and resistance, such as in Tibet or Kashmir, we have perhaps seen the expiration of, let us say, the sell-by date of the post-colonial state. We are no longer in a post-colonial period. Nationalism in the nation state has become a very different kind of entity, and strangely no longer provides the model for these new, including secessionist movements. The difference between China and India as far as the inheritance of empire is concerned has to do with the fact that despite being communist, the former very deliberately identifies with the entirety of its imperial history, not excluding the many instances of it in which the country was ruled by non-Han dynasties. And you see this kind of extraordinary claim to Chinese history. not least in China's struggles with India, where it seems ironical that a communist state should, offer imperial treaties from its own imperial past and from the British imperial past to justify its claims to Indian territory, but it does. This allows Chinese policymakers to literally inherit the borders and traditions of the imperial past and deploy both strategically. India, on the other hand, refuses to inherit large chunks of her own imperial history, especially that attributed to foreign and more particularly Muslim rule, and is thus unable to marshal it for strategic thinking. In other words, it possesses no continuous history in the mind of its own policymakers as much as citizens, and so cannot deploy the past for any political project except in internally divisive ways. So it's the imperial past that is used to foment and give a language to domestic and internal conflict in India, rather than being used strategically for its external power projections. Sort of fascinating situation that actually mirrors what I was saying earlier about the inheritance of empire, because China transformed itself internally when it became a communist country, but externally tried very, very hard to fit itself into an existing international order. India completely altered her international standing, as I was suggesting, by repudiating its imperial trappings. And so there was an external transformation, but internally, for a number of decades, kept in place many of these old colonial distinctions. And yet it is arguably India that remains the most imperial power in Asia, at least internally, because she has been unable to overcome her enormous diversities, despite continuing and self-destructive efforts to eliminate them. Here is a country where tens of millions of people are unable to communicate in any language with an equal number of their fellow citizens, and in which, therefore, constant mediation is required at the level of national politics. And while such diversity has always been seen by governments as a potential threat, it has had to be accepted as an inevitable for the most part, with uniformity sought to be constructed elsewhere. Today, it is sought in religious identity, as has been the case in Pakistan from the very beginning. Is it time then for both countries to acknowledge and work with their old as well as new imperial histories? Might this be a way to recognize the limits and violence of national uniformity without giving up on its traditional egalitarianism? If such a move is possible, it is surely because we have exited, as I said earlier, the post-colonial moment with its questioning of nationalist narratives, as much as the irrelevance of European imperialism to contemporary politics in Asia. A former student of mine, Ria Kapoor, in her thesis made this very interesting and I think quite accurate point, that with the Bangladesh War of 1971, in which India defeated Pakistan and indeed split it to create the new state of Bangladesh, what you see happening is, if you will, the end of post-colonial politics. Why? Because Bangladesh is arguably one of the earliest states that is formed not as an anti-colonial state, not as a state that emerges from imperialism, but as one that has actually seceded from and destroyed a post-colonial state. Its struggle was with a post-colonial state. So Bangladeshi national history is so fascinating because it rarely refers to the colonial period at all. Its struggle had always been with a nation state, that was Pakistan. And the rejection of the post-colonial state was marked by not an anti-colonial struggle, therefore, or a national struggle, but a civil war. In a way, I would like to speculate that Bangladesh represents not just the end of a certain kind of post-colonial history, but the beginning of a new way of thinking about nation building, state construction, and conflict from the 1970s onwards, in which it is the destruction of the post-colonial state through a civil war that is crucial. And of course, we see how the Civil War has become the sort of normative form of conflict in many different parts of the world, not least Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. So it is almost as if India and China have finally achieved a political and economic status globally that forces them to confront their imperial legacy in a new way, not simply as difficult to shake off detritus from the past, but as a means of imagining the future. Thank you.
Dear Faisal, thank you very much for your talk. We have already one question. It is from Siegfried Wolf, our Director of Research here at SADF. And he asks, when Xi Jinping describes the states who joined the Belt and Road Initiative as a community of shared future for mankind, or as a community of common destiny, is this, in your perspective, a new type of imperialism? Does this notion contradict national integration processes in Asian BRI countries?
It's interesting because obviously well, two things. One, and two cliches I should add. One is that this idea of a new Chinese imperium has been around for a long time. We needn't give it much credence, but the Chinese state itself seems to be anxious to forestall such criticism by incessantly talking up its peaceful expansion. So there's no rejection of the idea of Chinese expansion. How can it be rejected with the One Road, One Belt, One Road initiative and all the rest? But the emphasis is constantly on the non-conflictual or the harmonious or the peaceful character of this expansion. And in a way that goes back to much older ideas of imperial harmony and the acceptance of empire by subordinate groups. In the case of Obor, of course, there is apparently not meant to be any relationship of subordination involved, though we know in Africa and in other parts of the world, not least Pakistan, one of China's closest allies and perhaps one of its two only friends, the other being North Korea. Even there has been a great deal of anxiety about the peaceful expansion and rise of China. So I wouldn't, how should I put it? Even though I deploy the term empire and imperialism very frequently, and I certainly did in the talk just now, I don't want to confuse matters by suggesting that there is simply a continuity or that India and China have, how should I put it, have simply resuscitated older imperial forms. The reason why I bring empire to the fore is precisely because of my feeling, speculative feeling, that the post-colonial moment is sort of over, and there must be new ways of thinking about the political future. We see this all over the world. The EU itself is an example of, if you will, a non-national entity. How far it survives is another question, of course, because we're also looking at what appears to be the return of nationalism. But the post-colonial nation, it's not clear to me, not simply in the way that these new powers like India and China are behaving, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, in the changing nature of the resistance to them internally. The resistance is no longer based on nationalism or on the attempt to create a new kind of nation state. There is a kind of, there seems to be a desire to pluralize. And the only historical model we have, apart from these new federal models, like the EU, are imperial models. And those are among the reasons that I'm bringing the empire up, because in a way, these countries have to think through their imperial histories strategically and politically to imagine the future in which they want to move.
Okay, thank you very much. We then have a question from Rosa Maria Perez from ISCTE University of Lisbon Institute, who says, thank you for your challenging presentation. How do you see the emergent Indian religious nationalism within the political cartography of South Asia?
Religious nationalism in India? Is that
Indian religious nationalism, yes.
Yeah, that ostensibly, this is a phenomenon that has been around for a long time, for decades. But as my friend and colleague, Dr. Shruti Kapila, who teaches at Cambridge, is arguing in her forthcoming book, among the many things she's arguing in that book, she points out that the victory of so-called Hindu nationalism, is very recent. Its history does not, in fact, go back to the 1930s or the 1940s, despite anxious attempts to claim that history. In fact, it comes out of, it's a victory that emerges out of the 1990s, the period precisely of India's economic liberalization. There is something that twins economic liberalization and the rise of Hindu nationalism to power. It is a rise that is so spectacular that it actually puts its older history as a social movement on the back burner. But again, what this ends up meaning is that and you see this with Hindu nationalism in power. Hindu nationalism, like Indian nationalism more generally, had from colonial times possessed a kind of non-statist form, clearly. And it has never managed to repudiate that form. So the moment you have a Hindu nationalist government in power, there's an immediate tension created between its officials in power and the social movement itself. Both require each other, but those two forms cannot always be brought together in a harmonious or peaceable manner. It's not like a top-down control system that's happening. But even in older, in non-Hindu nationalist regimes in India, you had this situation where the state often outsources its tasks to social groups. And that's a kind of almost a harkening back to the colonial period when the nationalist movement played that role. The outsourcing is not due to the weakness of the Indian state. It is not a weak state. It has to do with this very peculiar history. So on the one hand, I'm sorry, this is a rather random response to that interesting question. On the one hand, I would like to suggest that Hindu nationalism shares something with Indian nationalism in the way it is structured. On the other hand, what I want to say is that, in fact, it is a very new phenomenon, and that it is linked in its novelty with liberalization, with the ending of the old ideological state, with its controlled economy and all the rest. So in that sense, it does have a global dimension. And it would be one that it would be interesting. It would be an interesting one to trace. People have done so by looking at the Indian or Hindu diaspora in America and in Europe and other parts of the world, which of course fund a lot of Hindu nationalist organizations. But how Hindu nationalism actually understands itself in the world, that really is the most important question, which I gestured to at the end of my talk, because as I suggested, the refusal to inherit the imperial past has meant, I think, an inability to understand India's role in the world geostrategically. That is, to my mind, the single most important weakness in that project, which ends up making Hindu nationalism simply into a kind of default majoritarianism within India itself, right? So despite the links to the diaspora and all the rest, that, it seems propelled by this old fear of the imperial diversity of India, which needs to be taken in hand, otherwise the whole place is going to, fly apart. And how might we take it in hand? By creating a majority, or by recognizing or acknowledging a majority. Where is this majority going to come from? We need to have a really strong one, and the only one we can think of, the only one that apparently exists, is this one that we can build upon. In that sense, there is nothing particularly theological about this. Unlike Islamic religious politics, the Hindu kind is, I would argue, entirely secular. Whatever it is that people believe in religiously or practice religiously, that is irrelevant. It is entirely tolerant of Hindu pluralism to some degree. It does not require belief or practice, apart from a very symbolic kind, and it is entirely geared towards the making, in a purely secular way, of a national majority. Yet its success is also a sign of failure, because it has abandoned any other vision of creating a majority, any other vision of creating a national culture. And so even the adoption of Hinduism as a national culture signals a failure. All right, Hinduism, of course, is the majority religion, but it is still a contraction of what India is. And so I see that failure and the anxiety that produces it as being in part linked to what I just suggested, the inability to think about the past, imperial past, both British and pre-colonial, and therefore the inability to think strategically about India's place in the world.
Thank you very much for this, Dr. Devji. We have questions raining in. Are you okay to take a few more? Okay, so we have a question from our executive director who left us at the beginning of this talk. And he says, thank you very much for your lecture. Do you think that Chinese imperial take over the South China Sea, rejecting the international law, and here he makes reference to the UNCLOS, has no parallel either in India or most of the world in the most recent years?
Yes, I think I would have to agree with that. But to put it in a bit of context, which doesn't, how should I put it, which draws back a bit from what appears to be the excessive nature of the Chinese presence there. Let me refer to my friend and colleague at Harvard, Professor Michael Pewitt, who works on China, as I'm sure you know, who very recently has remarked on how Chinese plans for, as it were, world domination, economic world domination, were put were cast into uncertainty by what the Chinese leadership apparently sees as the far more rapid decline of American influence and power in the world than they had imagined. That they had imagined they had another 50 years, in the background to work on their strategies in the background, and they required American dominance, American hegemony for another 50 years before their own, as it were, peaceful supposed rise to power. But American weakness has been shown up much earlier. The curtains have drawn apart much earlier, and China has been, as it were, literally pushed onto the center stage. And so the crisis of China is the crisis of how to actually assume this role of hegemon, and I wouldn't even say of hegemon, but certainly a global power, before its time has come. If Professor Pewitt is correct, then the various kinds of grandstanding exercises that China is conducting in the South China Sea and elsewhere are a sign of anxiety as much as anything else. They realize that their time hasn't actually come. And indeed, I would suggest that from what little I know, but taking into account what I know about Chinese history and what my colleagues who work on China tell me, that the anxiety also has to do with internal developments. So we tend to think of India as being completely obsessed by the possibility of her own fragmentation internally, which is one of the worries of Hindu nationalism, for instance. I think there's very little reality in that kind of anxiety. I think it's far more true to say this of China, which we think of as being completely sort of, in control of its internal politics. I suspect there is where you will see cracks and fissures developing, and this certainly is the argument of Michael Pewitt as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Next off, we go to Marca Valenta, who's coming from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Thank you very much for this talk. It is extremely fascinating and has made me think. And then she asks two questions. One of them is, are there key developments after the end of the Cold War that are shaping this shift in what is happening with nation states? So where does the Cold War fit into this narrative of post-colonialism and empire and nation state? Her second question is about technology. She asks, what about more recently the impact of social media and digital technology? Do you see this as incidental, secondary, or matter primarily of utility? Or does digital technology also have a causal role in this geopolitics of civilizational and national identity?
Yes, hi Marca. It's been a while since we met. Thank you for that question. Yes, I think the Cold War is, of course, crucial. And in some of my earlier work, I emphasize its importance, particularly when looking at the emergence of new Islamic forms of terrorism, for instance, in a kind of post-ideological world, if you will. In the case of India and China, of course, it's important because a new global arena is created for the first time. And this is where the technological dimension of your question joins up with the strictly geopolitical one. That with the end of the Cold War, it becomes possible to conceive of a global arena of information and goods and services, and let's say the movements of population migration as well. And it is knitted together by technology as much as by military and political decisions. And both of those things seem to be in crisis today. When India and China were seen as emergent powers, they emerged in this new arena where older geopolitical alliances had suddenly ceased to matter. So suddenly Europe was cut free, if you will. It was no longer the dividing line between East and West. Suddenly,
We appear to have lost Dr. Devji for a bit. We will try to get him back. So please bear with us for a second, please. Sorry, Dr. Faisal Devji, we lost you.
yeah, sorry, I went blank suddenly, I realized.
Yeah, we should take this as a normal with these new ways of sharing ideas. I'm very sorry. Do you know where you left off? Or
Yes, I think yes, I think I hope that goes at least some way towards addressing Marcus' question.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 4 more questions, and then I think we'll call it. I don't want to abuse your patience too much. We have a question from Nicolas Ravaille from France. He asks, the EU Commission will again negotiate with China. Do you think that this could have an impact on relations between the states in South Asia? What priorities should be put forward?
Yes, that's a very important and interesting question, which I'm not entirely qualified to answer. But I do think that I would imagine that what we've been seeing happening even over the last few weeks and months with regards to COVID-19 has thrown all plans in the air. On the one hand, of course, politically speaking, America has become unfathomable. One doesn't really know how it will respond and what's going on there, whereas China seems all too predictable, as if it has taken over the role of the former. On the other hand, the forces now aligning against China are very great indeed. India, I think, is poised to profit from this. And the people in Delhi, Mandarins in Delhi must all be rubbing their hands in glee, I imagine.
We seem to have a bit of an issue with internet connection. We'll wait a bit again.
To, as it were, ensure its rapid consolidation and entry into the global system. The very moment that is happening is also the moment of the greatest anxiety. Things are touch and go, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if even the most hopeful negotiations were upended only a few weeks down the line. So I think it's very difficult to say. The one thing I imagine is happening in the long run for Europe, since this question had to do with Europe, is that I hope at least that some consciousness of Europe's really quite unique position in the world and its newly independent position in the world. It requires other partners, of course, but given what's happening with its old American ally, and the new challenges that face it from Asia, Europe will have to really act independently for the first time in a long time. It is almost as if, going back to Marcus' question of the Cold War, it hasn't yet managed to get out of its Cold War mentality as this middle ground. And I would like to think that these negotiations with China, given the current circumstances, might be a site at which Europe starts emerging as an independent power or actor in its own right. It can certainly do this better now that Brexit has happened, whatever that means. And given, as I said, the geopolitical circumstances in which we are living. Okay,
thank you very much. We then have 3 more questions, if you allow us. We'll start with the more practical one, I think, and end with the 2 more philosophical ones. Then next up is our Director of Regional Cooperation Research Program, Professor Tomás Zentinho, who asks, what will be the role of cities like Mumbai, Kolkata, Kuala Lumpur in structuring the economic and political relations in Asia?
That's a fascinating question. You would imagine, I spoke in my talk about the so-called Shanghai model, especially for Mumbai. That, of course, is in the arena of the imaginary because thankfully, in my view, Mumbai is not going to become Shanghai. So there has been a great focus on these cities as great engines of growth. Whether in the post-COVID-19 period, growth is going to be as attractive any longer as it was is one kind of question we will have to face. Because of course, these cities are also the sites of the greatest fatalities, like New York, like London. So the force behind and the growth mechanism of these urban agglomerations are equally the signs of their weakness. In India also, you see something very interesting happening. The growth, not of the cities so much as of smaller towns. And that seems to be the, what's happening in urbanization in India. It's small to middle-sized, medium-sized towns that are rapidly expanding and where a great deal of economic activity is happening. I'm not sure whether you can say the same about China. Perhaps you can. But I think that certainly for India, that is where one needs to look. In a way that has been made possible despite India's creaky infrastructure, by information technology, by global supply chains, by all of these kinds of things, some of which are under threat post-COVID-19. So it would be interesting to think of how globalization, put broadly, seems to have resulted in the rapid expansion and growth of small and medium-sized cities rather than the more old-fashioned sort of massification of the megalopolis. Nevertheless, obviously, you're not going to discount big cities. In the case of a city like Mumbai, for instance, where it's old industry, mills, cotton mills, etc., and certain kinds of industry have either collapsed. So you have small-scale industry, small and medium-scale enterprises, very important for the Indian economy as a whole, on the one hand, happening both there and in smaller towns. And on the other hand, of course, for Mumbai in particular, it's finance. So this is not a first world city, yet, like London and New York, it is one that has moved, it's post-industrial in many ways. It's moved out of its old, milling history, industrial history, to finance, which arguably it always had, and to these small and medium level industries, which it shares with small towns, and which much of that activity also happens in the informal sector. That's another interesting thing about India. In fact, in what is known as Asia's largest slum, Dharavi, where you have, which is a kind of hive of economic activity. So it's, the taxes that are produced from a slum, which you would imagine to be an economically unproductive space, and the amount of activity that goes on there is astounding. So, these are various ways in which you can see how Indian or Asian, perhaps, cities work differently at some level from European and American cities, while nevertheless joining them as global cities, in the way that someone like Saskia Sassen writes about, whether there might be more relations of an economic kind between Mumbai and New York and London than between Mumbai and Kolkata, or between Mumbai and some other place within the country. So, on the one hand, you have the emergence of the global city with its connections being with other global cities rather than with its hinterland. On the other hand, you have these new developments, and these global cities also post-industrial. On the other hand, you have these sort of other things happening there, which link these cities back to their hinterlands, and to the rise of the small town as an economic powerhouse. So are we actually seeing, in a perverse kind of way, Gandhi's vision of a decentralized economic sphere in which, small is beautiful, as it were. Gandhi, of course, would not have approved of industrialization of this kind with the exploitation that it entails. But there is something going on there. I can't speak about Shanghai or Kuala Lumpur, except to say that in the playing field of global cities, as Sasson describes, they fit very nicely with Mumbai, etc. Kolkata is a different story altogether because it has emerged after 30 long years under communist rule, where it was deprived of its economic clout. Initially, of course, its economy was shattered by partition because Bengal's hinterland became East Pakistan, later Bangladesh. So it was deprived of much of its hinterland of jute farming and production. So it had, and then with communist rule, it declined as a city. And it's only recently that Kolkata is re-emerging in some kind of way. It's not clear how it might re-emerge, or whether Dhaka has actually taken over its role.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Our two last questions are somehow interlinked. So I think I'll ask them together, and then you can sort of give a response to both. They're from Dr. Maya Vodopivek from the Leiden University College in The Hague, and from Farnaz Kesoji, researcher at the Institute of Social Sciences in Lisbon. I'll start with Maya's. And Maya said, you mentioned the emergence of Asia with repudiation of post-colonial Asian identity, not reverse, and how India, after its independence, surprisingly rejected its imperial role in the British Empire. Of course, this rejection was the key part of their post-colonial identity, except for adopting the nation-state model. Neither China nor India found the source of their identity in any of the Western ideologies, but in communism, non-alignment, Afro-Asian solidarity, etc. Don't you think that the so-called new nationalisms that have emerged in both countries are actually mimicking the Western imperial way, or are they truly finding another way? And Dr. Farnaz Kesoji says that you mentioned an interesting change of the social and political representations of India and China with Hegel and Marx. Notwithstanding that interesting parallel, I wonder, how do Chinese and Indians perceive themselves vis-a-vis those representations? Do they internalize or resist those representations?
Thank you. Hi, Farnaz, and nice to have another friend join us. With Maria's question, was it Maria? Sorry, the first question was
Maya's.
Yes, Maya, sorry. Yes, I think that's actually very interesting. Just to continue something that I had broached in my talk, the contrasting dualities that defined Asia in European thinking have continued to inform certainly Indian policy, and I imagine Chinese policy as well, where India and China constantly see themselves as opposites of each other, or to use a Chinese framing, as their yin and yang of each other, nicely bound in a harmony. And sometimes this dual contrast is seen in exactly the same way as it is in the West. Democracy versus authoritarianism, for instance, right? It's become such a cliche that it's embarrassing even to repeat, but and a country like India will make full use of this cliche in its diplomacy, the world's largest democracy, etc. On the other hand, what I'm interested in is how this binary is collapsing, and collapsing with the remaking of world order, especially after the Cold War, as one of the early Marka, I think, was suggesting. and what I'm calling the end even of the post-colonial state-making moment. And I think it's this moment that in which we are in that these new interesting ideas are coming forth, especially from movements of struggle and resistance and even secession, which I've been looking at not simply as contrasts to these states, but as movements that actually tell us something about them, that weirdly reveal to us the nature of these states that they themselves might not be aware of. All right. So on the one hand, yes, both India and China, I think, have appropriated and adopted. Or am I confusing Farnaz's question with Maya's now about Hegel and?
I believe
Yes,
both questions asked about resistance and compliance or adoption. So,
and to go back to the first question, I mean, yes, it is entirely possible to look at the non-aligned movement and Afro-Asian unity as being simply versions of European or Western ideas, right? Of course, they were contesting Euro-American hegemony, but that didn't mean that they were entirely unfamiliar to that world. And you see this happening in the United Nations, especially in its early years when India is the leader in these, how do you, as Mark Mazauer has argued, Nehru is insistent on giving more power to the General Assembly as opposed to the Security Council, right? Insistent on anti-colonialism being part of the UN's agenda, insistent on Afro-Asian unity, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, as Robert Vitalis has pointed out in the very nice piece on the non-aligned movement, Nehru, the same Nehru, is contemptuous of it on various occasions. He prefers the Commonwealth Heads of State Conference to going to the non-aligned movement one. So it's back and forth. There is no, certainly as far as India is concerned, it wants to make itself, like China, at home in the global order dominated by the West, while at the same time trying to contest it. Now, you can see this in the way in which empire is inherited and repudiated at the time of independence as well. So as I was arguing, in an interesting way, China transforms its internal society, right? But its link to the European past, of course, is communism. So it adopts a kind of dissident European form to define its, if you will, post-colonial or communist self. Whereas India adopts a kind of establishment form of the European past for herself, because it opts for liberal, in quotes, liberal democracy. And all of this made perfect sense during the Cold War, clearly. And it's only now that these things no longer make much sense. And perhaps this is why the kind of obsessive and indeed now ridiculous gesturing towards the world's biggest democracy and all the rest. It's almost as if they see the power ebbing from these categories, which had once upon a time being Cold War categories. Now they have to be redefined. It's not that democracy is a bad thing, on the contrary, but you have to now think about it slightly differently from the way it was thought about in 1947.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your talk and for answering all of the questions that came in here. I can, addressing now the attendees of this talk, we hope to see many of you in our next webinar talks. The next by Dr. Christoph Jaffrelo, yet another sounding name in the field of South Asian studies, on the 28th of May, and you'll be able to find more information about this upcoming event shortly on our website and pages. And Dr. Faisal Devji. I think I speak for the whole of the SADF team when I say that we hope to have the opportunity to hear from you many, many more times. And as since you're in Oxford, and as the British MEP said, it's not goodbye, it's au revoir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Goodbye.